Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This story will make you uncomfortable. It will make you angry. And if you've ever loved someone who hurt you, it will break your heart. But I promise you, it will also give you hope.
Lord, help me, please.
Her name was Grace, and for 10 years she believed that loving harder would make her husband stop destroying her. She was wrong. The honeymoon lasted exactly 6 months and 3 days. Grace could pinpoint the exact moment it ended because she'd been standing at the kitchen counter, her hands dusted with flour, making chin-chin the way Chinedu liked it, crispy on the outside, soft in the middle, with just a hint of nutmeg. That's when she saw his phone light up with a message. She didn't mean to look. That's what she told herself later, during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come. She hadn't been snooping. The phone had simply been there, face up on the counter, and her eyes had simply landed on the words glowing on the screen. "Can't wait to see you tonight, baby. Wear that cologne I like." The message was from someone named Blessing. Grace's hands had gone still in the flour. She'd stood there, frozen, watching the message disappear as the screen went dark. Then she'd carefully wiped her hands on her apron, finished making the chin-chin, and said nothing. When Chinedu came home that evening, she'd served his dinner with a smile. She'd waited until they were in bed, the lights off, before she'd asked in the smallest voice possible, "Who is Blessing?" The silence that followed felt like falling. "Blessing?" Chinedu's voice had been casual, almost bored. "She's just a colleague from work. Why?" "I saw a message on your phone. She called you Grace." He turned to face her then, and even in the darkness she could feel the weight of his stare. "Are you checking my phone now? Is this what we're doing? You're going to be that kind of wife?" "No, I wasn't checking. I just saw—" "You just saw what you wanted to see because you're insecure. That's not attractive, Grace. You need to work on that." She apologized. In the darkness of their bedroom, with her heart hammering against her ribs, Grace had apologized to her husband for his betrayal. She'd promised to be less insecure, more trusting, a better wife. And Chinedu had rolled over and gone to sleep. 2 weeks later, he brought Blessing home. "Grace, this is Blessing," he'd announced cheerfully, as if he were introducing a new houseplant. "Her landlord is renovating her apartment, so she needs a place to stay for a couple of weeks. I told her we have a guest room. You don't mind, do you?" What could she say? That she minded very much? That the woman standing in her living room with an overnight bag was the same woman who'd sent that message? That her heart was breaking right there in the middle of the afternoon? "Of course not," Grace had heard herself say. "Welcome, Blessing. Let me show you to your room." She'd made up the guest bed with fresh sheets. She'd cooked enough dinner for 3. She'd smiled until her face ached. That first night, she'd lain awake listening to the sounds of her house. At 2 a.m., she'd heard footsteps in the hallway, the soft click of a door opening, the creak of floorboards heading in the direction of the master bedroom. Then, silence. Grace had pulled her pillow over her head and prayed. She'd prayed so hard her throat hurt, whispering into the darkness, "God, please, change his heart. Make him see me. Make him love me the way he promised to." Blessing stayed for 3 months. When she finally left, Grace convinced herself it was because of her prayers. She'd been fasting twice a week, reading her Bible every morning, being extra gentle with Chinedu, cooking all his favorite meals. Surely God had heard her. Surely the worst was over. It wasn't. Woman number 2 arrived when Grace was 7 months pregnant. She'd been carrying low, the baby heavy and restless, her ankles swollen by evening. She'd been in the kitchen, trying to find a position that didn't make her back ache, when Chinedu walked in with a young woman Grace had never seen before. "Grace, this is Chisum. She'll be staying with us for a while." No explanation, no apology, just a statement of fact. Chisum had looked Grace up and down, her eyes lingering on the pregnant belly, and smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "You look tired, Sister Grace. Maybe that's why he needed someone who can still take care of him properly." Grace had gripped the edge of the counter to keep from falling. That night, she'd had her first contraction. The doctor said it was stress, that she needed to stay calm for the baby's sake. So Grace had swallowed her tears, plastered on a smile, and pretended having her husband's mistress in the next room was perfectly normal. 3 weeks later, her water broke at 2 a.m. Chinedu wasn't home. When she called him, panicked and in pain, he answered after 6 rings, his voice thick with sleep. "What is it, Grace?" "The baby's coming. I need to go to the hospital." "Now? Can't it wait until morning?" She bit her lip hard enough to taste blood. "No, Chinedu, babies don't wait." "Call a taxi. I'm too far away to come back now." He'd hung up before she could ask where away was. Grace gave birth to Chimdi at 6:47 a.m. with only a nurse holding her hand. When the baby was placed on her chest, tiny and perfect and hers, she wept. Not from joy alone, but from a grief so profound she couldn't name it. The nurses asked about her husband. Grace had smiled and said he was working. She'd become good at lying for him. She hadn't even realized she was doing it anymore. Chinedu showed up 3 days later with flowers and an excuse about a business emergency. He'd held Chimdi for exactly 4 minutes before handing him back, saying he needed to make some calls. Grace had watched him walk out of the hospital room and wondered if this was what the rest of her life would look like, watching the man she loved walk away over and over again while she held her child and pretended everything was fine. By the time Chimdi turned 2, there had been 5 women. 5 different faces moving through Grace's home like tourists in a museum, admiring what they wanted to take. Some stayed for weeks, some for months. Grace had learned to keep her head down, to make herself small, to pray silently while cooking meals for the women sleeping with her husband. One afternoon, while Chimdi napped, Grace had finally broken. She'd gone to see her pastor's wife, a woman everyone called Mommy Ife, who was known for her wisdom and her 40-year marriage. Mommy Ife had welcomed Grace into her sitting room, offered her tea in a delicate china cup, and waited. "Mummy, I don't know what to do anymore," she whispered, her voice shaking. "My husband, he keeps bringing women home. He doesn't even hide it anymore. Yesterday, one of them asked me to wash her clothes." Mommy Ife stirred her tea slowly, the spoon clinking against the porcelain. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "Grace, my dear, marriage is not easy. The enemy wants to destroy your home. He's testing you through your husband, and you must not fail this test." "But, Mummy, I've been praying, I've been fasting, I've tried everything." "Have you examined yourself? Have you asked God to show you what you might be doing wrong?" Grace had felt the words like a slap. "What I'm doing wrong?" "Yes, my child. The Bible says a wife must submit to her husband in all things. Perhaps there's a spirit of rebellion in you that's pushing him away. Are you still attractive to your husband? Do you dress well at home, or have you let yourself go? Do you satisfy him as a wife should?" Grace's hands had trembled around the teacup. I try to." "Then try harder. A good woman can keep her home together through prayer and submission. Don't be like these modern women who abandon their marriages at the first sign of trouble. Remember, what God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Grace had left that meeting feeling smaller than she'd arrived. If the pastor's wife said it was her fault, then maybe it was. Maybe she wasn't praying hard enough, fasting long enough, submitting completely enough. She'd tried talking to Chinedu's mother next. The older woman had listened with her arms crossed, her face unreadable. When Grace finished speaking, she'd shaken her head slowly. "My dear, men are like that. Do you think you're special? My own husband had 3 women outside our marriage. I knew about all of them, but I stayed, I endured, and look at me now, respected, honorable, with my marriage intact. If you leave over small things like this, what will people say? That you couldn't keep your home? That you're a failure as a woman?" "But he beats me sometimes," Grace had whispered. "When he's angry about something at work, or when I ask about the other women, he—" "Then you must learn not to provoke him. A wise woman knows when to speak and when to be silent. This is your cross to bear, my daughter. Carry it with grace." The irony of that statement hadn't been lost on Grace. Carry it with grace, as if her name itself was a prophecy of suffering. She'd even tried talking to her own mother. "Grace, you have a child now. You must think of Chimdi. Every child deserves to grow up with their father. Don't be selfish. Marriage requires sacrifice. Your father and I had our problems too, but we stayed together. That's what commitment means." Everywhere Grace turned, the message was the same. Stay, submit, endure, pray harder, be better, try more. No one said, leave. No one said, this is wrong. No one said, you deserve better.
If you are already hooked on this video, I'd like you to support my work. Stories like this take time to come together. I'd appreciate it if you can hit that subscribe button and like the video so more people get to see it. Now let's go back to the story. Woman number 6 arrived on Chimdi's 4th birthday. Grace had saved money from her teaching salary for months to throw him a proper party. She'd ordered a cake decorated with his favorite cartoon characters, bought balloons, invited children from his preschool. She'd woken up at 5 a.m. to start cooking jollof rice and fried chicken, to make small chops and fruit punch. The party was supposed to start at 2 p.m. At 2:15, guests began arriving. Grace welcomed them with a bright smile, her eyes constantly darting to the door. At 3, she started calling Chinadu's phone. It went straight to voicemail. At 4, she cut the cake without him, holding Chimdi's small hand in hers as they blew out the candles together. At 5:15, when most of the guests had left, Chinadu finally walked through the door. With her. "Grace, this is Adese," he'd announced loudly, as if he were the host of a show. "She'll be staying with us. Clear out the guest room tonight." The few remaining guests had fallen silent. Grace's parents had been there, her sisters, her neighbors. Everyone had heard, and everyone had pretended they hadn't. They'd smiled stiff smiles, made excuses to leave, gathered their children, and hurried out into the evening. Grace's father had pulled her aside on his way out. "Don't cause a scene," he'd whispered urgently. "You're embarrassing yourself. Handle this quietly at home." That night, after putting Chimdi to bed, Grace had locked herself in the bathroom. She'd turned on the shower to muffle the sound and screamed until her voice gave out. She'd screamed for the woman she used to be, for the dreams she'd had, for the daughter who'd worn white lace and believed in forever. When she finally emerged, red-eyed and hoarse, Chinadu was waiting for her. "I need you to quit your job," he'd said. Grace had stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "Your job, at the school. You need to quit." "But why? We need the money. Your business hasn't been—" The slap had come so fast she didn't see it coming. One moment she was standing, the next she was on the floor, her cheek burning, the taste of copper in her mouth. "Don't question me," Chinadu had said, his voice eerily calm. "You're never home. You're always at that school, acting like you're independent, like you don't need me. It's disrespectful. A proper wife stays home and takes care of her husband." From down the hallway, Grace heard Chimdi crying. He'd seen it. Her 6-year-old son had watched his father hit his mother. Grace had touched her throbbing cheek and made a decision. Not the decision she should have made, not the decision that would have saved her, but the decision that seemed safest in that moment. "Okay," she'd whispered, "I'll quit." She'd submitted her resignation the next day. No explanation, just a short letter thanking them for the opportunity. Her colleagues had tried to convince her to stay, but Grace had just shaken her head and cleaned out her desk.
For the next 3 years, Grace had no income, no independence, no money of her own. She'd used up her savings to buy food, pay bills, keep the lights on, while Chinadu's business mysteriously never seemed to have enough money for household expenses, but always had enough for new clothes, expensive shoes, and dinners with his women. Grace became a ghost in her own life. She stopped laughing, stopped singing in the shower, stopped having opinions. She moved through her days like a sleepwalker, cooking, cleaning, caring for Chimdi, and trying to disappear. She stopped praying for Chinadu to change. Those prayers felt foolish after the 5th woman, pointless after the 6th. Now she prayed simpler prayers. God, help me survive today, just today. People at church commented on how much weight she'd lost, how tired she looked. They said they were praying for her, but no one asked what was really happening, or maybe they knew, and asking would mean they'd have to do something about it. So no one asked. Woman number 8 was named Nkechi, and she was nothing like the others. The others had been grateful for whatever scraps of Chinadu's attention they received. They'd been willing to share, to compromise, to exist in the shadows of his marriage. Not Nkechi. Nkechi arrived like a hurricane, and from the first moment she saw her, she knew something had shifted. This woman looked at Chimdi's home with the eyes of someone already measuring for new curtains. "So, you're the wife," Nkechi had said, not even bothering to hide the disdain in her voice. "Chinadu told me you were traditional." It was not a compliment. Within a week, Nkechi had moved her things into the master bedroom and told Grace to sleep in the guest room. Grace had looked at Chinadu, waiting for him to say something, to defend her, to remember that she was his wife. He'd just shrugged. It's easier this way, less drama. Grace had moved her things in silence. She'd lain awake in the guest room, listening to laughter coming from what used to be her bedroom, and tried to remember the last time Chinadu had laughed with her. She couldn't. Nkechi redecorated the living room, throwing out the furniture Grace had bought with her teaching salary. She changed the locks on the master bedroom. She sat at the head of the table during dinner and expected Grace to serve her first before even serving Chimdi. And Grace did it all. Because leaving meant divorce. Divorce meant shame. Shame meant failure. And failure meant admitting that 10 years of suffering had been for nothing. So Grace stayed, even as she was erased from her own life. Until the morning Chinadu called her into the living room where he and Nkechi were having coffee. "Grace, sit down," he'd said. She'd sat, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the floor. "I want you to leave," Chinadu had announced as casually as if he were ordering breakfast. "Take Chimdi and go. I don't need you here anymore." Grace's head snapped up. "This is my home. We're married. You can't just—" "Can I?" Chinadu had leaned back, completely relaxed. "Watch me." "I won't leave. God will change your heart. I know He will. I just need to keep praying, keep believing." "God?" Chinadu had laughed, actually laughed. "Grace, God gave up on this marriage years ago. You're the only one still pretending." But Grace had refused. She'd clung to that house like it was the last solid thing in a world gone liquid. She'd told herself it was faith, but really it was fear. Fear of being alone, fear of what people would say, fear of admitting that she'd wasted a decade on a man who never loved her the way she deserved. For 2 months, she'd stayed despite Chinadu's demands that she leave. She'd endured Nkechi's insults, Chinadu's contempt, and her own growing sense that she was clinging to a corpse and calling it a marriage. Then the landlord came. He'd knocked on the door on a Tuesday morning. Grace had opened it, expecting a package or a neighbor, and found herself face to face with the building owner. "Good morning. Is Mr. Chinadu home?" "No, he's at work. Can I help you?" "I need to speak with him about the rent. It expired last month, and he said he wasn't renewing. I need to prepare the property for new tenants." The world tilted. "Not renewing?" Grace heard herself say from very far away. "But we live here." The landlord looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, maybe you should discuss this with your husband, but yes, he told me 3 months ago that he'd be moving out. I assumed—" He trailed off, his eyes filled with pity that made Grace want to disappear into the ground. That evening, when Chinadu came home with Nkechi, Grace confronted him. "The landlord came today. He said you're not renewing the rent." "That's right," Chinadu said, not even looking at her. "Nkechi and I found a new place, a better place. We're moving next week." The words hung in the air like smoke. "What about me? What about Chimdi?" Chinadu had finally looked at her then, and what Grace saw in his eyes was worse than anger. It was nothing. Absolute, complete indifference. "That's no longer my problem, Grace." They moved out on a Friday morning. Chinadu and Nkechi and all the furniture, including the pieces Grace had bought with her own money years ago when she'd still had a job. Grace and Chimdi stood in the empty house, no chairs, no beds, no curtains, nothing, and listened to the echo of their own breathing. Her 10-year marriage hadn't ended with an argument or a divorce lawyer or even a conversation. It had ended with an eviction notice and a husband who walked away without looking back.
If you are already hooked on this video, I'd like you to support my work. Stories like this take time to come together. I'd appreciate it if you can hit that subscribe button and like the video so more people get to see it. Now let's go back to the story.
Grace and Chimdi moved back to the village with 2 bags between them. Everything else, her clothes, her photos, her books, the small treasures she'd collected over the years, was gone. Either thrown away by Chinadu or taken by the various women who'd moved through her home like locusts. Her father's compound looked smaller than she remembered. The mango tree she used to climb as a child was still there, older now, its branches heavy with fruit no one bothered to pick. Her father had opened the door, taken one look at her face, and stepped aside to let them in. He hadn't asked any questions. Maybe he already knew the answers. Grace had been given her old room, the one she'd left 10 years ago as a bride, full of hope and white lace. Now she returned to it a ghost, with a 9-year-old son and a shame so heavy she could barely breathe. For 3 months, Grace did nothing. She woke up, fed Chimdi, sat under the mango tree, and stared at nothing. She prayed, but the prayers felt like they disappeared into the sky, unanswered and unheard. "God, why?" she'd whisper. "Why did you let this happen? I did everything right. I submitted, I prayed, I fasted. I stayed when any reasonable person would have left. Why wasn't I enough?" The villagers talked, of course. They always did. Grace could feel their eyes on her back when she walked to the market. She could hear the whispers pause when she approached, then resume when she passed. That's the one whose husband left her. After 10 years. So sad. She must have done something wrong. Good wives don't get thrown out like that. I heard he had other women, 8 of them. Can you imagine? Then she definitely wasn't satisfying him. A good wife would have kept his attention. The words cut deeper than any of Chinadu's slaps had, because at least with physical wounds, people could see your pain. With shame, you carried it alone, invisible and festering. Chimdi adapted to village life with the resilience of children. He made friends with the neighborhood kids, helped his grandfather in the small farm, learned to climb the mango tree. Sometimes Grace would watch him play, his laughter ringing across the compound, and wonder how someone so small and innocent had survived 10 years in that house of pain. But Grace herself couldn't adapt. She felt like a stranger in her own skin, like she'd left pieces of herself scattered across the last decade and didn't know how to gather them back. One evening, she'd been sitting under the mango tree watching the sunset when she'd heard a car pull up to the compound. Cars were rare enough in the village to draw attention, and Grace had looked up to see a sleek sedan parking near the house. Her sister, Ifeoma, had stepped out. Ifeoma was the family anomaly, unmarried at 38, running her own business in Lagos, living life entirely on her own terms. Their mother prayed for her constantly, convinced that Ifeoma's independence was a tragedy waiting to be resolved. At family gatherings, relatives would pat Ifeoma's hand sympathetically and promise to keep looking for a suitable husband, as if she were a lost item that needed finding. But watching her sister stride across the compound in her elegant business suit, her head high and her steps confident, Grace realized something. Ifeoma looked free, truly, completely free in a way Grace had never been, even before Chinedu. "Grace," Ifeoma had called out, her voice sharp with concern. "What are you doing here?" Grace had tried to smile. "I live here now." "Like hell you do." Ifeoma had sat down beside her on the bench, close enough that Grace could smell her expensive perfume, jasmine, and something else, something that smelled like success. "I just heard what happened. Why didn't you call me?" What was there to say? That I failed? That I wasted 10 years? That everyone was wrong and I couldn't keep my own marriage together? "Everyone was wrong," Ifeoma had said fiercely, "and you didn't fail, he did. That man failed you every single day, and everyone around you failed you by telling you to stay." Grace had felt tears coming and had tried to hold them back. She'd cried so much in the last few months that she thought she'd run out of tears, but apparently not. "I don't know how to do anything else, Ife. I was a teacher once, but that was 7 years ago. I have no recent experience, no updated certifications, no money. What am I supposed to do? Who will hire someone like me?" "Come to Lagos," Ifeoma had subbed suddenly. "You and Chimdi, come stay with me." "I can't impose like that." "Grace, stop. Just stop. For once in your life, let someone help you. Let someone tell you that you're worth saving, because you are. You always have been." Grace had looked at her sister, unmarried, successful, everything their family had been taught to pity, and had realized that maybe the people who've been giving her advice all these years didn't actually know what they were talking about. Maybe disobedience to men didn't mean disobedience to God. Maybe walking away wasn't giving up. Maybe it was the only way to survive. "Okay," Grace had whispered. "When?" "Saturday. I'll come back Saturday. Pack light. We'll figure out the rest when we get there." If you've made it this far in Grace's story, I want to ask you to do something. Hit that subscribe button. Not from me, but because stories like this need to be told. Because somewhere out there, there's another Grace who thinks she's alone, and she needs to know she's not. Lagos was chaos incarnate. The noise hit Grace first. Car horns, street vendors, gospel music blaring from a nearby shop, the constant hum of generators, people talking over each other in a dozen different languages. After the quiet of the village, it felt like being dropped in the middle of an orchestra playing different songs simultaneously. Ifeoma's apartment was in Lekki, small but beautifully decorated. 2 bedrooms, a living room with actual furniture, a kitchen with appliances that worked. To Grace, it felt like a palace. "You and Chimdi take the spare bedroom," Ifeoma had said, already making space in the closet. "It's not much, but..." "It's perfect," Grace had whispered, touching the soft bed sheets like they might disappear. "Ife, thank you. I don't know how I'll ever..." Don't thank me yet. Thank me when you're standing on your own 2 feet again. That's when the real work begins." For the first 2 weeks, Grace did nothing. She slept and cried and slept some more. 10 years of accumulated exhaustion hit her at once. She'd wake up in the middle of the night panicking that Chinedu was yelling for her, that one of his women needed something, that she'd forgotten to do some crucial task that would result in punishment. Then she'd remember she was in Lagos. She was safe. No one was going to hit her. No one was going to scream at her. No one was going to parade his mistresses through her living room. Slowly, carefully, like a flower uncurling after a long winter, Grace began to heal. Ifeoma had a routine. Every morning, she'd wake up at 5:30 a.m., make coffee, and sit on the small balcony to watch the city wake up. After 2 weeks of sleeping until noon, Grace joined her. They'd sat in silence that first morning, sipping coffee and watching the sun rise over Lagos. Finally, Ifeoma had spoken. "You need to start looking for work." Grace felt panic rise in her chest. "Ife, I can't. I'm not ready. I don't even know what I do. It's been 7 years since I know, and you're going to fail at first. You're going to bomb interviews. You're going to doubt yourself. You're going to want to give up, but you're going to keep trying anyway." "How do you know?" Ifeoma looked at her then, really looked at her. "Because you survived 10 years with that man. If you can do that, you can do anything." The first interview was a disaster. It was for an administrative position at a small tech startup. Grace had dressed carefully in one of Ifeoma's business suits, rehearsed answers to common interview questions, and arrived 15 minutes early. Then the interviewer asked her about the gap in her resume. "You haven't worked since 2018. Can you explain that?" Grace's mind went blank. She'd opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Her hands started shaking. She felt tears coming and was powerless to stop them. "I'm sorry," she whispered, standing up abruptly. "I'm so sorry. I can't do this." She'd fled the office, taking the stairs because she couldn't bear to wait for the elevator, and had cried in the parking lot for 20 minutes before calling Ifeoma to pick her up. "I told you," Grace had sobbed in the car, "I can't do this. I'm too broken." "You're not broken," Ifeoma said firmly. "You're healing, and healing doesn't happen in a straight line. It's messy and painful, and sometimes you take 3 steps back before you take 1 step forward, but you keep moving." The second interview was nothing much better, or the third, or the fourth. By the 5th interview, Grace was ready to give up. She'd started looking at job postings in the village, thinking maybe she should just go back, accept her fate, live quietly in her father's compound until she died. But then she'd seen Chimdi helping Ifeoma cook dinner, laughing at something silly, looking happier and lighter than he'd ever looked in that house with Chinadu. And Grace had realized something. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her son to see that her mother was strong. So she'd gone to a 6th interview. It was at a small logistics company in Acacia. The office was nothing fancy, just a few desks, some filing cabinets, a water cooler that gurgled ominously in the corner. The woman who interviewed her was in her 50s, with kind eyes and hands that looked like they'd worked hard for everything they had. Her name was Mrs. Adeyemi. "Grace," she'd said, gesturing to a chair, "tell me about yourself." Grace had taken a deep breath and started with the standard answers, her education, her brief teaching career, and then she'd hit the gap. 7 years of nothing. 7 years that would make any employer move on to the next candidate. "Your CV shows a significant employment gap," Mrs. Adeyemi had said, not unkindly. "From 2018 to 2025. Can you explain that?" For a moment, Grace had considered lying. She could say she'd been traveling or studying or caring for a sick relative. She could construct a story that didn't involve shame and failure and 8 women who'd been given her husband while she'd been told to pray harder. But she was tired of lying. She'd spent 10 years lying for Chinedu, lying to herself, lying to everyone who asked if she was okay. So, for the first time, Grace told the truth. "I was trying to save a marriage that didn't want to be saved," she'd said quietly. "My husband, he was unfaithful, multiple times, with multiple women. Everyone told me to stay, to submit, to be patient. So I did, for 10 years. He made me quit my job because he said working made me disrespectful. I stayed because I thought that's what good wives do. I stayed because I was afraid of being called a failure. I stayed until he threw me out and I had nowhere else to go." Mrs. Adeyemi had been silent for a long moment. Grace had braced herself for the rejection, for the polite smile and the "we'll be in touch" that meant never. Instead, Mrs. Adeyemi had leaned forward. "And now?" she'd asked. "Now," Grace had paused, feeling the weight of the question. "Now, I'm trying to save myself." Mrs. Adeyemi had studied her for what felt like an eternity. Then she'd nodded once, decisively. "You start Monday, 8 a.m. sharp. Don't be late." Grace had stared at her. What?" "The position is yours. Administrative assistant. It's entry level, the pay isn't great, and you'll be doing everything from filing to answering phones to making coffee. But if you work hard, if you're willing to learn, there's room to grow." "But I don't have recent experience. I don't have—" "What you have," Mrs. Adeyemi had interrupted gently, "is something far more valuable. You have the courage to start over. Most people don't. They stay in situations that kill them slowly because they're too afraid to begin again. You're here. That takes strength. We'll teach you the rest." Grace had walked out of that office in a daze. She'd sat in the bus on the way back to Lekki, staring out the window at the city rushing past, and had felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Grace's first day at Delta Logistics was terrifying. She'd woken up at 5 a.m., her stomach in knots. She'd changed outfits 3 times before settling on a simple blue dress and flats. She'd arrived 30 minutes early and had sat in the reception area, watching the clock and trying to remember how to breathe. Mrs. Adeyemi had introduced her to the team, 6 other people, all younger than Grace, all moving with the easy confidence of people who belonged in office spaces. "This is Grace," Mrs. Adeyemi had announced. "She's joining us as an administrative assistant. I expect everyone to help her settle in." Grace's desk was in a corner, near a window that looked out onto a busy street. It wasn't much, just a computer, a phone, some filing trays, but to Grace it felt like a throne. The work was overwhelming at first. She'd forgotten how to use most computer programs. She didn't understand the company's filing system. She mixed up client names and got flustered when the phone rang. By the end of the first week, she was convinced they'd fire her. But they didn't. Mrs. Adeyemi had called her into the office on Friday afternoon. "Grace, how are you settling in?" "I'm trying," Grace had said honestly, "but I feel like I'm drowning. Everything is so different from when I last worked, and I keep making mistakes." "Of course you do. You're learning. Do you know what I see when I watch you work?" Grace had shaken her head. "I see someone who arrives early and stays late. Someone who asks questions when she doesn't understand instead of pretending she does. Someone who apologizes when she makes a mistake and then makes sure she doesn't make it again. That's worth more than experience, Grace. That's character." Grace had felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you, Ma." "Don't thank me. Just keep showing up. That's all I need you to do. Show up, work hard, and trust that you're exactly where you're supposed to be." So, Grace showed up. Day after day, week after week, she showed up. She learned the computer programs, she memorized client names, she organized files and answered phones and made coffee, and slowly, gradually began to feel competent again. 3 months in, something shifted. Grace was filing invoices when she overheard a conversation between Mrs. Adeyemi and one of the senior account managers. "We need someone to prepare the bid documents for the Ministry of Transport contract," the account manager was saying. "But everyone's swamped. I don't have time to put together a proper presentation." "What about Grace?" Mrs. Adeyemi had said. Grace's head snapped up. "Ma, you've been watching how we put together these proposals. Do you think you could handle it?" Grace's first instinct was to say no, to shrink back, to insist she wasn't qualified. But something else rose up in her, something that had been buried for a decade but wasn't quite dead yet. "Yes," she'd heard herself say, "I can do it." She'd worked on that proposal for 2 weeks, staying late every night, researching, writing, revising. Ifeoma had helped her practice the presentation, playing the role of a tough government official asking difficult questions. The day of the pitch, Grace's hands had trembled as she set up the projector. The conference room at the ministry was intimidating, large, formal, with stern-looking officials seated around a massive table. But when Grace began speaking, something miraculous happened. Her voice steadied, her hands stopped shaking, the words came easily because she'd prepared, because she'd done the work, because for the first time in years, she was using her mind for something other than figuring out how to survive. The officials asked questions. Grace answered them. They raised concerns. Grace addressed them. They looked skeptical. Grace showed them data, projections, testimonials. When it was over, the head official had nodded slowly. "Miss Grace, that was impressive. We'll review all the proposals and get back to you within 2 weeks." Grace walked out of that building, stepped onto the busy Lagos street, and had laughed out loud. Not the bitter, broken laugh from the empty house. This was different. This was joy, pure and uncomplicated, and hers. 10 days later, Mrs. Adeyemi called her into the office with a smile that could have lit up the city. "We got it," she said simply. "The ministry contract, 5 million naira. And Grace, you led that bid. This is your win." 5 million naira. Grace remembered the months when she'd had to beg Chinedu for money to buy food. She remembered counting coins to pay for Chimidi's school fees. She remembered the humiliation of being financially dependent on a man who despised her. And now, she just helped her company secure a 5 million naira contract. "There's more," Mrs. Adeyemi had continued. "I'm promoting you to junior account manager. You'll be handling your own clients now, with mentorship from me. You've earned this, Grace." That evening, Grace had come home to find Ifeoma cooking dinner, Chimidi doing homework at the table, and everything felt surreal, like she'd stepped through a doorway into someone else's life, someone successful, someone capable, someone whole. "I got promoted," Grace had announced, her voice shaking. Ifeoma had dropped the spoon she was holding and pulled Grace into a fierce hug. "I knew you could do it. I knew it." "How?" Grace had whispered. "How did you know when I didn't?" "Because broken things aren't garbage, Grace. They're just things that need time to heal, and you're healing." Over the next year, Grace's life transformed in ways she couldn't have imagined. She handled more contracts, 10 million naira, 15 million, 20 million. She learned to negotiate, to network, to trust her own judgment. She moved from junior account manager to senior account manager. Her salary increased, her confidence grew. She saved enough money to rent her own apartment. Small, just 2 bedrooms, but hers. When she'd signed the lease, she'd stood in the empty living room and cried. This time, the tears were for what she'd survived, for what she'd become, for the woman staring back at her in the bathroom mirror who looked like Grace, but stronger, wiser, more certain. Chimidi enrolled in a good school, one with music programs and sports teams and teachers who called to tell Grace how bright her son was, how kind, how full of potential. Sometimes Grace would watch him at school events, confident, laughing, unburdened, and she would think, this is what children look like when they grow up in peace. She bought her first car, used but reliable, and drove herself to work every morning with the windows down and gospel music playing. She started going to a new church, one where the pastor preached about God's love without weaponizing it, where women weren't told that their suffering was holy, where grace meant kindness, not endurance of abuse. She made friends, real friends, women who'd also survived difficult things and had come out the other side stronger. They'd meet for lunch and tell their stories, and Grace realized she wasn't alone. There were so many women carrying the same scars, the same shame, the same question. Why didn't anyone tell us we could leave? But even as Grace's external life transformed, there was still something unhealed inside her. Men noticed Grace. Of course they did. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with makeup or clothes, and everything to do with the light that had returned to her eyes. She moved differently now, with purpose, with confidence, with the quiet power of someone who died and come back to life. At church, a deacon named Brother Emeka asked for her number. At work, a client asked her to dinner. At Chimidi's school, a teacher had lingered after parent-teacher conferences to ask if she'd like to get coffee sometime. And every time, Grace felt panic close around her throat like a fist. What if she chose wrong again? What if she missed the signs? What if she gave herself to someone who would break her the way Chinedu did? What if? She'd been sitting on her small balcony one evening when the sun was setting when her phone rang. Ifeoma. Grace, there's someone I want you to meet. No, I'm not ready. I didn't say a date, I said someone I want you to meet. His name's Emeka. Different Emeka. This one's a widower, a father of two, runs his own consulting firm. He's been through some things too. I think you'd like him. Just coffee, 1 hour. If you hate it, I'll never bring it up again. Grace wanted to say no. She wanted to say she was scared, too damaged, too afraid of making the same mistakes. But she'd also spent 10 years letting fear make her decisions, and where had that gotten her? Okay, she whispered. Just coffee. They'd met on a Saturday afternoon at a cafe in Victoria Island. Emeka was tall, with graying hair at his temples and kind eyes that had seen sadness. He'd stood when she arrived, pulled out her chair, and waited until she was settled before sitting down. Grace, thank you for agreeing to meet me. I know Ifeoma can be persuasive. Grace had smiled despite her nerves. That's one word for it. They'd talked for 3 hours. Not about romance or attraction or whether they were interested in each other. They talked about life, about his wife who died of cancer 4 years ago, about his children who were learning to laugh again, about his business, his faith, his fears. And Grace had found herself talking too, about Chinedu, about the 10 years, about the 8 women, about waking up in an empty house and realizing her marriage had ended with unpaid rent, about teaching herself to be strong when every part of her wanted to stay broken. I'm scared, Grace had admitted finally. I'm scared of trusting the wrong person again. I'm scared of missing red flags. I'm scared that I'm so desperate to not be alone that I'll ignore my instincts. Emeka had nodded slowly. After my wife died, I went on a few dates. They were disasters. I was looking for someone to fill the hole she left, and that's not fair to anyone. It took me 2 years to realize I needed to be whole first, by myself, before I could be healthy with someone else. And are you whole? Getting there. Every day, a little more. What about you?
Grace had thought about it. Was she whole? She had a job, an apartment, a car. She was providing for Chindi, building a life, healing from wounds that had gone deeper than she'd realized. But whole? I don't know, she'd said honestly. I think I'm closer than I've ever been, but there are still days when I wake up and expect to be back in that house, with him, with them. There are still moments when I hear a man raise his voice and I flinch. There are still nights when I lie awake wondering if God was punishing me, if I deserved everything that happened. Did you? Emeka had asked gently. No, Grace had whispered, and realized she meant it. No, I didn't deserve that. No one does. They'd started seeing each other after that, slowly, carefully, with all the caution of 2 people who'd been burned before. Coffee dates became dinner dates. Dinner dates became weekend outings with their children. Emeka met Chimdi at a park. He'd brought a football, and they'd played for hours while Grace watched from a bench, her heart doing complicated things in her chest. Chimdi had been wary at first. He'd learned not to trust men who smiled too easily, but Emeka had been patient. He'd let Chimdi set the pace, never pushing, never demanding. Grace met Emeka's children at their home, 2 girls, 10 and 12, who looked at Grace with the careful assessment of children who'd lost their mother and weren't sure if they wanted another woman in their father's life. Grace hadn't tried to be their mother. She'd just been herself, kind but not pushy, interested but not intrusive. She'd asked about their schools, their hobbies, their favorite foods. She'd listened when they talked about their mother, not trying to replace her, but honoring her memory. Slowly, trusts began to build. But even as things progressed with Emeka, Grace found herself pulling back sometimes. He'd reach for her hand and she'd tense. He'd mention the future and she'd change the subject. He'd talk about his feelings and she'd deflect. Finally, 6 months in, Emeka had asked the question Grace had been dreading. Grace, what are we doing here?
They'd been sitting in his living room, the children asleep in their respective homes, the night quiet around them. "What do you mean?" "I mean, every time I try to get closer to you, you pull away. Every time I mention the future, you shut down. I need to know, are you in this, or are you just going through the motions because it's easier than being alone?" The question had hit Grace like a slap, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. "I don't know how to trust you," she'd admitted finally. "I don't know how to trust anyone. I don't know how to let someone love me without waiting for the moment when they reveal that love was conditional all along. Chinetto told me he loved me. He promised before God to cherish me. And then he brought 8 women into my home and told me it was my fault. How do I know you won't?" "You don't," Emeka had said gently. "You can't know. That's what faith is, Grace. Not faith in me, but faith in yourself. Faith that this time, if someone shows you who they are, you'll believe them. Faith that you're strong enough to walk away if you need to. Faith that you deserve good things, and that accepting good things isn't a betrayal of everything you survived." Grace had felt tears coming. "What if I choose wrong again?" "Then you'll survive again, because that's what you do. But Grace, you can't let him win twice. Chinetto took 10 years. Don't let him take the rest of your life by making you too afraid to live it." That night, Grace had gone home and prayed differently than she'd ever prayed before. Not, "God, send me a husband," not, "God, take away my fear," but, "God, help me trust myself. Help me believe I'm worth loving. Help me accept joy without waiting for punishment." And slowly, prayer by prayer, day by day, Grace began to heal from the wounds she couldn't see. 18 months after Grace had gotten her job, 2 years after she'd left the village, 3 years after Chinetto had walked away without looking back, Grace received a phone call. It was a number she didn't recognize. "Hello? Grace? It's Chinetto." The world tilted. Grace sat down heavily on her couch, her hand gripping the phone so hard her knuckles went white. "Why are you calling me?" His voice sounded different, smaller somehow, tired. "I wanted to see how you were doing. How's Chimdi?" Rage rose in Grace's throat, hot and bitter. "You don't get to ask about Chimdi. You threw us away like garbage, remember? You told me I was useless. You left with another woman and didn't look back." I know I hurt you. But Grace, I've been thinking." "Don't." Grace's voice was steel. "Don't you dare." "Things didn't work out with Nkechi, or the others. I've been alone for a while now, and I realized that maybe I made a mistake. Maybe we could—" "No." "Grace, please, just hear me out. I know I wasn't the best husband, but we had something once. We could try again, start fresh. I've changed." Grace laughed, actually laughed. The sound was sharp and bright and completely without humor. "You've changed? Tell me, Chinetti, which one of the 8 women helped you figure that out? Was it Blessing, Shisam, Adayeze, and Getchi, or was it one of the others whose names I've tried to forget? That's not fair." "Not fair? You want to talk to me about fair? You beat me. You humiliated me. You made me quit my job. You used my money while spending yours on other women. You brought your mistresses into my home and made me cook for them. You threw me and your son out like we were nothing. And now you want to talk about fair? I was going through things. You don't understand the pressure I was under. I don't care." And Grace realized she meant it. She genuinely did not care about his excuses, his reasons, his justifications. "I don't care what you were going through. I don't care if you're lonely now. I don't care if you think you've changed. You are not my problem anymore." So that's it? 10 years of marriage mean nothing to you? 10 years of marriage meant nothing to you. I was the one who stayed. I was the one who prayed. I was the one who submitted and believed and trusted and endured. And you threw me away. So yes, that's it. Goodbye, Chinetto. She'd hung up before he could respond. Her hands were shaking, her heart was pounding, but underneath the anger and the shock, there was something else. Relief. Because she'd said no. She'd said no to a man who'd once had complete power over her. She'd said no to the voice that had haunted her nightmares for years. She'd said no, and the world hadn't ended. The world had in fact continued spinning just fine. That evening, Grace had dinner with Emeka and their children. They'd gathered around her small dining table, Chimdi, Emeka's daughters Zainab and Amara, Emeka, and Grace herself. It was crowded and chaotic, with everyone talking over each other, reaching for food, laughing at Chimdi's terrible jokes. And Grace had looked around that table, at her son who was thriving, at Emeka who'd proven his character day after day, at the girls who were beginning to trust her, at this family they were slowly, carefully building, and she'd felt it. Peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of joy despite it. Not the erasure of her past, but the proof that the past didn't have to define her future. "You okay?" Emeka asked softly, noticing her tears. Grace wiped her eyes and smiled. "Yes, I'm more than okay. I'm free." 3 years later, Grace stood in front of a mirror in a small changing room, looking at her reflection. She was wearing a business suit, navy blue, perfectly tailored, preparing for the biggest presentation of her career. Delta Logistics had been shortlisted for a government contract worth 50 million naira. Grace would be leading the pitch. Mrs. Adeyemi, now more mentor than boss, popped her head into the room. "Ready?" Grace took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready." As she walked toward the conference room, Grace thought about the woman she'd been 5 years ago, the woman who'd sat in an empty house, broken and discarded, convinced her life was over. That woman wouldn't recognize the person Grace had become, wouldn't recognize the confidence, the strength, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The presentation went perfectly. Questions were asked and answered, concerns were raised and addressed. When it was over, the officials smiled, genuinely smiled, and told her they'd be in touch. Grace knew they'd won before they made the official call. That evening, Grace went home, not to Ifoma's apartment or a rented room in the village, but to her own house. She and Emeka had married quietly the year before, and they'd bought a house together. Nothing ostentatious, just a comfortable home with enough bedrooms for everyone, a garden where Chimdi liked to play football, and a porch where Grace and Emeka would sit in the evenings and talk about their days. Marriage, Grace had learned, could be something entirely different from what she'd experienced with Chinedu. It could be partnership instead of ownership. It could be mutual respect instead of submission. It could be safe. As she pulled into the driveway, she saw Chimdi through the window, helping Emeka with dinner. Her son was 14 now, tall and confident, planning to study engineering. He'd never forgotten those years with Chinedu, but they hadn't broken him either. He'd learned that men could be kind, that fathers could be present, that love didn't have to hurt. Grace walked into her home, her actual, real, safe home, and was greeted by the smell of cooking, the sound of laughter, the warmth of people who chose her every day. "Mom," Chimdi called out, "how did it go?" "We got it, 50 million naira." The house erupted in celebration, hugs and high fives, and Zainab already planning how we should celebrate. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Grace and Emeka sat on the porch looking at the stars. "Do you ever think about him, Chinedu?" "Sometimes, not as much as I used to. Last I heard, he was still alone, still looking for whatever it is he thinks will make him happy. I used to pray he'd change. Now I just pray he finds peace." "That's generous of you." "It's not generosity, it's freedom. I spent so long letting his actions define my worth. I don't do that anymore. He's just a man who made terrible choices. Those choices aren't mine to carry." Emeka squeezed her hand. "I'm proud of you. You know that, right?" Grace smiled. "I'm proud of me, too." And she was. Proud of surviving, proud of leaving, proud of building a life from nothing, proud of learning to love again, proud of teaching her son that strength sometimes looks like walking away. The woman who wore white lace and believed love could conquer anything was wrong. Love alone wasn't enough when it was only flowing in one direction. But the woman sitting on this porch, successful and healed and surrounded by people who chose her every day, had learned a different truth. You can't pour from an empty cup. You can't love someone into changing. You can't submit your way into safety. And sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is save yourself. Grace had spent 10 years trying to be enough for a man who would never value her. She had spent the next 5 years learning to be enough for herself. And that, it turned out, made all the difference. If Grace's story has touched you, if you see yourself in her journey or know someone who needs to hear this, I ask you to do one thing. Share this. Not for me, but for all the other Graces out there who think they're alone, who think they deserve the pain, who think leaving is failure. They need to know you are not too broken to be rebuilt. You are not too damaged to deserve good things. And walking away from what's destroying you isn't giving up. It's waking up. This is Grace's story, but it could be yours too.